Yeah. Is that ours? Do we have music?
Yeah.
We do.
Jags, bring us in.
Oh, wow. Really?
You're in charge.
Oh, damn. I don't even have the little intro thing. All right, I got this. Let me know when we're ready. Ready? All right.
We're ready.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to our, I guess, monthly Glasshouse Center talk. I think we had originally aspired to do this more often, but it's a little unrealistic with folks' schedules. As it is, I'm afraid that we've lost the Grug today. He's not feeling his best, and people are busy. But we really wanted to make sure that we had time to have one of these in December before everybody breaks for all the festivities. So as usual, everybody here is representing themselves and not their employers or any other organizations they're affiliated with. This isn't exactly a shitposting forum, but it may as well be in a lot of ways. And I think that it's appreciated for its irreverence. I don't know that we've really set out a whole ton of topics for today. There have been a lot of things that have been going on. I think we've been discussing internally, we've been having a lot of conversations about the stuff that's happening in Iran, which is a topic near and dear to me. We've been praising ESET's research into air gap jumping operations. What else, guys? Are there other topics that you guys have in mind?
Well, let's start there, to be honest. I think we all attended Jason Healy's Cyber Norms sort of Zoom meeting yesterday, or the day before, and probably some of the other people on the Twitch stream have also attended that. And I think one thing that really stuck out at me was we're talking about cyber norms, and then Jason Healy asked, or someone from the audience asked, what is the story with the Iranian train hacking? Because that falls into critical infrastructure, and there's been gas hacking, right? So that's critical infrastructure. I think we would all agree. And the Microsoft person sort of dissembled, right? So the answer to the thing was, he was like, Iran's done a lot of real bad stuff too. I don't want to get into it. I don't really, know a lot about it, right? And I think that's been the whole community, right? It's not just this one Microsoft person, it's the whole community. And so there's something really weird there, but I wanted Jags to really weigh in on it, because you've been, I don't know, you wrote the first paper on this, am I right?
Yeah.
Where are we at with this thing?
So, well, okay, let's be fair about the Jason Healy thing. I asked the question because I was a little bit bored and annoyed, but also because I really wanted to hear. Actually, I was hoping that it would be some of the UN folk that would weigh in on this, because my question was couched in notion of fact finding, right? I know that there were people who saw Meteor Express stuff, not all of it, but people saw this and decided not to report on it. So in the first place, there's something there that makes me deeply uncomfortable. And then even after I wrote up on it, and then Checkpoint wrote up on it, and JD wrote up on it, and we started to see other follow-up attacks, we were still largely ignoring this thing. So, that I think that speaks to kind of your sentiment, Dave, there. To me, the situation is uncomfortable in the sense that I think Western governments have been the most vocal, with this sense that we have the most to lose about, this ICS thing. That has to be the critical infrastructure has to be the land and the line in sand. That has to be it, right? All the other stuff, we can get pissy about, we can get upset about SolarWinds and whatever, but critical infrastructure is supposed to be the line. And that line kind of keeps getting blurred and blurred. So the notion that one of us or a friend of ours has decided, well, fuck it, let's just go to town on Iran, is uncomfortable. I don't have a bleeding heart for the Iranian government, but I think that we're seeing a bunch of norms and precedents kind of bent in interesting ways, and nobody's talking about it.
All right. So, I mean, just to push back on some of the stuff, I I think we should give a slightly better history of the analysis, the public analysis that was out there, right? Because you wrote a paper, and I think for a time we were not sure if it was hacktivism. Like, how did this evolve? Can like for me watching this video 6 years from now, how did we get here?
All right, yeah. So let's start this properly. So we've been hearing about hacks in Iran. And this is being couched in this sort of tit for tat Israel-Iran thing, which I think is part of the problem in this narrative. Where it gets really interesting is in July, we hear that the Iranian railway system had gone down, and it was all couched in this epic troll where they go, they wipe the machines and they put up these signs sort of all over the train stations that said, trains delayed due to cyber attack. Call 64411, which is the number of the Supreme Leader's office. So a lot of people were like, oh my God, hilarious, right? Epic troll. To me, of course, it's funny, but if you take a step back, like it's like, well, someone just, popped something that by any conventional standards, we might say is some form of critical infrastructure. And all I kept thinking was, if this had happened in Chicago, we would be losing our minds. So, that's where the work really starts. We rebuilt the toolkit. It's a new actor as far as we can tell. It's an English speaking actor, or at least whoever develops it is English speaking. I don't think that necessarily means it's the US. But I think it's important to put that out there because it actually shows some massive recurring OPSEC failures there that should be discussed. Then Checkpoint comes in, figures out that older samples connect to a different hacktivism group. So that's where it ties into my talk from CyberWarCon. It's like there's a hacktivism group called Indra, hacktivism, quote unquote, that was conducting attacks against Syrian companies that were supporting the IRGC. And they were using the same malware that Meteor Express uses for the Iran railway thing, which is not attributed to Indra. It's connected to a different group that JD Work actually pointed out called Predatory Sparrow. So there's at least 3 hacktivism fronts that get involved in these disparate attacks. I think, look, I try to be fair to Checkpoint, but they really bought the hacktivism idea hook, line, and sinker.
Checkpoint is an Israeli company, right?
I mean, I prefer to be fair to these companies in the sense that like they're fairly global at this point. So don't let me sling mud for no reason. I think that could be thrown at just about any of us at this point. But dude, look, I'm happy for people to report on operations they think might be Israeli or they think might be the US. Like once you've delved into it, if you want to, make a more complex calculus of it, I get it, but don't just avoid it, right?
It's super bad analysis for people to just blanketly avoid it. And there's been a few cases like this in the past where folks have been like, I think this is US and I'm not going to risk my clearance on it. And I'm like, what the fuck, bro? This is something that you got off Virus Total. Like, if it's on Virus Total, like sorry, it's in the open now.
But this might be the line that we disagree with most with Dave, maybe.
Well, I guess one of the things about that is, like, to me, that looks like a just massive distortion in the market because the classified market is such a big part of the top end market right now, right? Which it's like sort of shaping the market like a gravity well in a sense. But I think when it intersects with norms, we get extremely confused because if the whole market is ignoring like how we conduct operations and norms they're symmetrical at some level. They're not completely symmetrical, but they're essentially bilateral discussions. And it almost feels like we can't reach norms because our internal market is so distorted and so confused about what's really happening in the world. Does that make any sense?
I think so. I wouldn't have pointed at the market, to be honest with you. My thinking still in sort of a Western centrism is I think we have the worst part with norms precisely because we are the most reticent nation on earth in discussing cyber operations, right? Like to a point of ridiculousness. I understand that operations are meant to be covert. I understand that Stuxnet is part of a bigger thing, and you have these negotiations with Iran. You have all these problematic things, but we have reached the point of ridiculousness 10 years after the discovery of the big bad Stuxnet. U.S. government folks still can't admit that that was us or that we had anything to do with it, and it makes if we can't admit that one basic fact, it makes it even harder to have substantiated discussions about like, yeah, okay, we do things, but this is how we do things, and we do them better, and we're restrained, and we don't do this or that. Like those are conversations you can have with when you own up to your part on the table.
The challenge is though, is when you have those discussions, and if you say like, these are the lines we won't cross, it truly eliminates those from the table, as I think many of these decision makers are thinking about it. Or if it's they say like, we don't do sabotage operations, and then it's the like, but Stuxnet could have been viewed as a sabotage operation. Like essentially, they limit themselves, and by this strategic ambiguity, they give themselves a full range of options by never admitting any of it.
I think that's the cover that they would use for being vague. I think one of the other things about this is that I noticed there's sort of a lack of details when you enter this norms discussion, and it really hinders you. So the answer may not be that like, oh, we keep saying critical infrastructure is off the table. What we really mean is like critical infrastructure is mostly off the table except for certain situations when done in a certain way.
Well,
Like
you're never going to limit like hybrid warfare approaches, right? Like you can talk about critical infrastructure all you want, but the day that you're flying planes in, like, yeah, disable the radars. Like, you know what I mean?
That comes at a like a, even from international law, that comes on a different side of the table.
Right.
But for this one, we're talking, these were companies that were under sanctions that were perhaps operating, as the Western governments would say, essentially illegally. And so may have been on the table because of that, or there may be different rules when you engage with those companies that's on that.
Mhm.
And I just think there's sort of like a lot of details that go into some of these legal and operational concept discussions that we don't discuss because we're blind to anything that any Western government does, if that makes any sense.
I think it's blindness to what the Western governments do, in a sense, right? Not every Western government, right? Like I actually admire France immensely. I love pointing this out. I think Animal Farm slash Babar, Casper, Dino, whatever the hell you want to call it, it might be the only Western APT that's been outright owned by the perpetrating agency, right? DGSE years after the fact came out and said, yeah, that was us, right? They didn't make it a huge official announcement, but they owned it, right? And that, in my mind, might be the only situation where you have a Western government saying, yeah, that was our toolkit, those were our ops. And in a large part, I mean, it isn't a bad operation to own. There was a fairly legitimate remit to what was happening. They were fairly careful. They weren't indiscriminate to the extent that I can think of right now. In their minds, I'm sure that to some extent that there was a lot of, maybe some counterterrorism stuff rolled in there. I mean, there were legitimate reasons to do it. And I think that you could have similar discussions, for example, with all the CIA stuff that we've seen. The targeting is fairly pinpoint. It's fairly restrained. It isn't some dragnet thing. It isn't intellectual property theft. They're looking for the kinds of things that you would expect the CIA to look for. So I understand that there's covertness, but I think this is falling into that horrible sink of overclassification issues where everyone's just kind of trapped and bound.
Well, I also think that, like, if you're going to say there is a responsible way to conduct offensive operations and an irresponsible way to conduct operations, then in order to say what responsible is, you have to have examples to point at. And this Iran operation may be one of those examples. And I thought the complete lack of any discussion or attention on that for what it is amazing. Like you say, if it happened in Chicago, we'd be freaking out. But if it happened in Brazil, we would probably also be freaking out, right? Like or any other country other than Iran. We would be focusing. I tend like not we. When I say we, I mean y'all, right? Like, I mean the incident response community would be like all over writing papers. What's happening?
Right.
What are the details, right? So, and I
I
don't
mean,
think the
that
Iranian
was
government.
Ukraine, right? That was Ukraine to some extent. You know,
Yeah,
everybody, the two blackouts were like seminal moments where everybody was running, trampling over each other to get research out. And you know, and then it wasn't as hot anymore. Like I'm sure there's stuff still happening in Ukraine, and not everybody cares quite as much, which is sad. But to your point, so there's two sides to it, right? I do think it's important to document what's happening in Iran from a policy norms, whatever perspective. I do think we should be having much broader discussions, even about there are people who ran out and said, "Oh, this must be the U.S. Like, let's not touch it." And it's like, I'm sorry, if this is the U.S., something has changed, and we should have a conversation about what has changed. Like, if this is Cyber Command coming onto the table, fantastic, welcome, guys. But like, wow, like, is this what we're gonna have? Is this what we expect from Cyber Command now? Like, are they going to, in a restrained fashion, systematically fire sale a country, right? Because it was the trains, it was the gas pumps, it was the Evan prison thing, which again, no one can object to abuses in one of the worst prisons on earth being exposed. But let's have a conversation about what that means about how you approach attacking a nation, right?
and I think one of the things that really stuck out at me was that the attackers had made an effort to contact emergency services and tell them to gas up before they turned off the gas.
Did
Right?
they do that? I didn't know that.
Apparently, they say they did in their telegram.
Oh,
Like
right.
that I have no, the Iranian government hasn't posted any transcripts of it, but like that's what they say they did.
But that's huge though. Like even just that self-acknowledgement of an idea, like that is something that's a forefront thought out issue. Like to pre-notify emergency services to ensure that like critical support things don't fall down. Like that to
Yeah.
me, it complicates that. It complicates the attribution. Is really a more sophisticated thing than I would have expected.
There's 2
Well,
points
exactly.
there's 2 things that I would point out there. First of all, I have to give credit. We have to give credit to JD Work on his paper about predatory sparrow, because his whole point isn't about this attack, but rather to say, look, this is an example of responsible ops, even with wipers, even with critical infrastructure. Like, look at how restrained they're being. So that JD, I really wish JD were here for that. The other side of this is I didn't know about, getting emergency services to gas up, but one thing they talked about in their Telegram channel was also that they had reported a vulnerability to Ingenico that, they noticed in those point of sale systems along the way. I have my doubts about whether they even used any of that, because Hamid Kashfi and I have been kind of working on what we see kind of coming out of these attacks for the gas one, for the what was the recent Mahan Air one. Like, we've been collecting different bits and pieces of what's happening there, and I'm not even sure that attack happened quite that way. But as far as the stance of the attackers goes, there's a lot of contradictory stuff there, right? Like the way Silas is saying, okay, if they actually did this thing where they notified emergency services to gas up and whatnot, that interesting bit of sort of ethical restraint and proactivity, the disclosure thing of a potential vulnerability, interesting. And yet you're still doing this under the guise of a hacktivist front. And there's something that's like, there's an unnecessary layer of deception there that seems kind of self-defeating, or it doesn't quite put you as the complete ethical actor in that space.
It's very interesting. I mean, the other thing I noticed about their work is that like their Telegram feed was in Farsi and English. Like they translated it for you.
They tagged the reporters.
So they tagged the reporters to make sure people saw it.
Yeah.
That's not terribly uncommon though. So like lab, oh god, now I hope I don't be out pronouncing
Duchtagon.
Thank you. The one that always I describe as lab, oh shit. Because I can never figure out how to pronounce the name. Like I believe they've done that for years, and some of the other ones as well, like will do that translation in English as well, just because it ensures a broader audience of people can read it.
And you don't want to be misunderstood with your signaling and whatever else. But I think, Jag started out saying, this stuff blurs the lines. But I think the reality is the lines are blurry, like they're wide and blurry. And what this stuff does is allows us to explore those lines. So, but only if we do the analysis.
Right,
Anyway.
right. And it's funny, right? I'm not working with the Iranians. Perdas is not sending me samples. There's a fortuitous situation here where I can kind of fourth party my way into this analysis, and it's not going to be open forever. So that's part of my emphasis on this of like, look, there's very sparse visibility here. We should all be pulling together to understand what's happening here. And look, this is where the threat intel industry and this intelligence LARPing that a lot of people seem to think they're involved in gets so ridiculous. Like, look, fine, if you were in the IC before, or if you have an active clearance, like you can talk about your ethical conundrums there. Fine, I understand. But you have a job in a private sector company that has commitments to global customers. And you don't get to sit down and say, oh, when you get attacked by these guys, it's okay. At least not as far as detection goes and analysis goes. If you don't want to call attention, okay. But let's not pretend that every company here has amazing coverage when it comes to Meteor Express or the shadow broker stuff or Vault 7 or Regan or any of that. It's more of a willful, ignorance kind of situation.
I think there's one side of it. I think the weird thing is incident response is like the base layer. All this analytics is like the base layer to the policy discussions, right? So one of the big problems with all the policy discussions is how much stuff is classified. And so none of like the real data can be used for the policy discussions, which means you inevitably get insane policy from a shadow world of mirrors. And I think that's where I saw like the Jason Healy thing sort of reaching a crest, right? So we're in this conversation, you ask a very reasonable question so that we can base policy discussion on it, and we cannot get an answer.
Yeah. I mean, you get a very telling answer in a lot of ways, right? I think there's several aspects of that, and not to pick on this Microsoft dude, but like there's several aspects of that we need to understand, right? I couch my question as fact-finding because of the UN folk being there, right? So if you have no independent fact-finding, and let's face it, none of us, as far as the private sector goes, as far as I know, are really on the table with the UN. Like, yeah, some of us advise, I've talked to them, other folks have talked to them, but you're not at the table telling them like, this is how it happened, like detail by detail. So if they're not doing independent fact finding, and we're not really looking into these things and really pushing them down, and the stuff is so, classified that nobody's going to talk about it, not only can you not blame them for it, but it puts you in this very awkward situation where you get the kind of mentality that this Microsoft person spoke to, which is, first of all, you can't think of Iran as anything other than an attacker. They're not a victim ever. They're not someone to sympathize with. Like that, the way that he spoke of it, we asked about attacks happening to Iran, and he spoke about Iran attacking other people. So we're not even going to consider that. The other side of it is, I like that it's Microsoft in particular, because Microsoft attempted to create some kind of body that was supposed to do this, inform people on the basis of their telemetry and whatever. And that was what the Cyber Peace Institute was supposed to be. And in reality, it isn't anything like that, as far as I can tell. And like, I have friends there and I respect what they're trying to do, but it's not a powerhouse of telemetry. It's not a powerhouse of independent analysis. They're not putting forth things about these different attacks. I don't know that they have any, researchers in house as far as their intel stuff goes. So I don't know what the Cyber Peace Institute is, other than, a lobbying arm for Microsoft. Again,
and that's the thing, actually. I feel like that would just be a nice thing to put together, maybe even just for us internally here. Is just a like metric for evaluating an institute based on the likelihood that they are just a lobbying arm. Because the thing is like, I love the idea of the Cyber Peace Institute. I truly, truly love the conceptual idea. I don't like it when somebody tells me that they are entirely independent from Microsoft and Microsoft has no sway over it, and they hand me a Microsoft business card. No offense to the person I'm in this incident.
Right.
Point is, though, if you're an independent institute and you're free of corporate handcuffs restricting it, and you're trying to produce analysis, you then have to do the things that an institute like that should do, which is to publish papers, to hire like industry experts to just write reports and inform the broader community at large. Because like that's the purpose of Intel, is to enable decision makers. And if your view of how you enable decision makers is, let's talk about the Jedi contract, like
right. And I mean, let's face, okay, again, we're stomping on the Cyber Peace Institute, but in particular, I think it's important to discuss what was supposed to make them different, which was resources, not just money. I mean, money's important. You need to be able to hire folks and pay for whatever, but also they were supposed to get telemetry. They were supposed to have access to the stuff that Microsoft generates. I thought that was Brad Smith's whole, grandstanding deal on this. And to be fair to the Cyber Peace Institute, I'm pretty sure they didn't get that. I'm pretty sure they don't have that data. And again, to be fair to Microsoft, hey, at least they tried. Where the hell are Google and Amazon on this? Like I complain about Google and Amazon all day long. In reality, it's because they're not even at the table, and they have unbelievable resources, but they just can't be bothered. So we judge Microsoft for the Cyber Peace Institute in the way that I judge Apple for security, right? Like I expect better. They're trying. So, we impose greater standards, but for all the time that we spend shitting on iOS, Android is 10 times worse and nobody says anything, right? So just to be fair.
I mean, I want to also call out some research that came out this week from ESET that I think we've all been going through. And ESET has done really good work for I don't know. I remember I have links to some of their old papers. So it's been a very long time. And I didn't used to follow threat intelligence at all. But I think they did a really good analysis of Flame, for example. And they've been doing really good work for a while. And I think this paper that they came out this week with, which they called Jumping the Air Gap. What's the real name of this paper? I actually have it up. That's it. 15 years of nation state effort. I don't know that they're all nation states, but I don't have a dictionary in my head just with a bunch of these random cryptonyms stuffed into it. So
I mean, it's part of their point, right? That the only air gap jumping stuff they've seen by their strict definition is nation state ops,
which I think is fascinating.
Right.
And all right, so I wrote a big paper on this a few years ago because I was also really interested in analyzing it to try to get into more of a cyber policy angle. And one of the things you see is that early command and control protocols were very synchronous, right? If you think about Metasploit, Canvas, Core Impact, any of the early stuff, even to this day, I think Cobalt Strike is this way, right? You connect to something or it connects to you, and then you send it a command, and then it answers your command, and that's how life works. Right. So very synchronous. It's like an early paramecium. Right. So, but to get past this hump, to go into an air gap situation or a more complex network situation, you're building asynchronous command and controls. Right. So you're throwing commands out into channels. Some of them get answered different orders. You're getting data back in a different way from where you ask the question, for example. A lot of really interesting work here. So I was trying to analyze some of the protocols, and I think they did a really good job of summarizing and taxonomizing this whole space.
Yeah, a ton of credit to them. I mean, I'm really happy that you're bringing them up in the broader context of their research. I have this love affair with ESET research, and I've worked at all kinds of competitors, but never worked at ESET, but have unbelievable respect for them. Another area that I would point out before I forget, everybody's been raging about supply chain attacks. ESET has dropped 8 papers on regional supply chain attacks this year or in the past 2 years that nobody's talked about, and they are fantastic. So if you're obsessing over software supply chain, go check out ESET stuff. For the air gap paper in particular, this kind of research is not as motivated or as incentivized as it should be. It's the kind of thing that you see for virus bulletin papers from time to time. But it's fantastic. Like Silas and I were sitting there and like, dude, like they did the work. You can literally sit here and be like, look, these are the 4 characteristics of every air gap jumping attack we've seen in the past 10 years. Let's write a few rules and like you're covered, right? Let's go, let's see what falls out in a few weeks, which is fascinating. And they still went into the kind of detail that I will admit my own ignorance. I have worked on Stuxnet stuff. Silas and I both worked on Stuxnet stuff with Stuxshop and whatever. And I've always referred to the LNK exploit. Apparently not an LNK exploit. Apparently it's a CPL exploit within an LNK. So there's a lot, you know, they went forest and trees. Like there's a lot of, I have a lot of respect for this paper.
And I mean, I think what I don't like about your community, let me just be completely honest. What I don't like about the incident response community is I feel like this paper will go out there.
You know, we're threat intel people, by the way, you know.
Whatever it is, right? Like threat.
The way that you're just a very tanned man, we are threat intel people, not
whoa. It's CTI now.
It's
Sorry.
CTI.
It's just like how we also wear pink on Wednesdays. It's CTI now.
Okay. So what I don't like about the CTI community is that I feel like a really good paper like this will come out. And because everyone else is competing with ESET, people aren't going to build upon this work the way they really could. And I also, you know, frankly, because they're not an American company, I think that the policy community won't focus on it as much as it should either. I could be wrong about that.
So I can't speak to the policy community. Those people make no sense to me. And that's a part of why we're in this Glasshouse Center, right? Like I said in the beginning, the irreverence is what makes this a policy discussion that we can all sit through without either falling asleep or throwing up. But as far as the threat intel community, look, man, there's some of the motivations of the threat intel community are very much within marketing. And some people seem to think that if you mention your competitor's name, that you're giving them free press. To me, I think not doing that, it takes a lot of legitimacy out of your research. Like, look, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, from the software we use to the findings other people have made to the, whomever we sat next to and learned from, right? Like, let's not pretend that we were all born reversers and malware analysts and whatever. You need to give people credit. And like, look, I'm the first one to get pissy when like Checkpoint took Meteor Express and decided to rename it and run with it. I was upset. I was the first to admit it, and I said it on Twitter. It's vanity on my part. But when it comes to research in particular, like what you're describing right now, there's not naming them, and then there's not following up. And I think both happen, right? Like what we're talking about, Silas and I are sitting here going like, oh, let's write Yara rules based on what ESET put out. And if we find something, I'll be the first person to say, thank God for this ESET report. And here's this other air gap jumping thing that we found. And I think it gives you a lot of legitimacy. It stop pretending that we're all superhuman and that, apart from people like Coast and Ryu, we are, not born with like an APT gut instinct. You are working on the basis of what you hear from other folks.
So I'll actually add as well, if I don't see a significant number of things referenced in a paper, I immediately start to worry more and more about the quality of it, because it to me says that the authors have not done their due diligence to understand the basics of all of the other things that have happened. So if you're presenting brand new, fresh research that's only based on, say you're presenting on like Plug X or something, which has been beaten to death over the years, but still is important, but you never cite any of the other critical bits of research, and it's just we're the only ones that have ever reported on it.
Yeah, let's not get too inside ball in the sense of like airing grievances between companies. Let's look at it from a different perspective. And I'm not blaming you for that, Silas. I'm
not picking on a specific instance here in the slightest, like just
right.
purely.
No, and again, I'm not blaming you for that. But what if we pull out a little bit? There's another version of that problem, which is that it incentivizes newcomers into the space to act and report in that way. If anybody saw this tardigrade report over the past week, trigger warning to any researchers, like that thing is not grand. So it's the BioISAC putting out an APT ransomware report. And frankly, good marketing, the research doesn't stand on its own. And in reality, it doesn't stand on its own just out of lack of familiarity. Like, it's kind of sad because you read the report and you're like, look, these are biotech folk trying to do IT, trying to do defense. They noticed a targeted ransomware attack that was going after their sector. And cool, like up to that point, I get it. But when you read the details of it, they talk about like nation state payloads, including Conti and Ryuk and Cobalt Strike. And you're like, okay, you guys are not familiar with nation state malware or what these payloads are. So of course, when you see what is a common double extortion operation from a ransomware group that looks like an espionage op first, because they're gonna put your stuff on a leak site, and then is a ransomware op, then you can go, oh my God, we found APT ransomware. It's like, no, that's just the paradigm as it is now. Sure, somebody could be and probably is leveraging that data somehow, but this is primarily a set of financially motivated actors that are well established in the space. So I do blame some of the marketing garbage for making other people think that that's how you should do threat intelligence.
Well, I think having garbage reports out there that are not based on anything misstates the state of the world, which then filters into our policy discussions, right? So you see over and over the less informed members of the policy world saying, why don't we just use air gaps? Everyone use an air gap.
It's the basics, stupid.
It's the right. And so there's a couple things here, right? And I saw actually even like I went to a couple really big conferences last week virtually. And one of them, like one of the very old school people who's very well respected, was like, if we can just get everyone to do cyber hygiene, the ransomware problem will go away. And I think I was like, the ransomware companies are making like $35 million per hit. They have more money than any penetration testing company I know, which means they can hire a couple good people to innovate. And I just don't think hygiene gets you that far, right? Like hygiene, there is just where they're at now. Yeah, you can improve your hygiene. You have to like improve your hygiene to be better than a military industrial complex person before you can meet the challenge of someone with $1 billion in the bank or $5 million in the bank for you. You know what I'm saying? Like the specialist targeting that you will get when someone is looking at you as a $35 million target.
They're not even trying that hard. I mean, so there's a natural evolution to ransomware in phases over the past 5 or 6 years, right? And I think cyber hygiene was the conversation that we had 5 or 6 years ago, when ransomware was some skid created a thing that's even rolling its own crypto, and they're opportunistically hitting people for $300 and $400 in order to get their pictures back. That's when cyber hygiene should have been part of the conversation. When now we're talking about targeted stuff with, you know, plenty of lateral movement or whatever. Yes, it's not the most sophisticated thing you will ever see, but it does test your resilience as a company, your awareness, like how much visibility you have, what controls you have, do you have any segmentation? Which, by the way, I think we should teach Nicole Perlroth the word segmentation, because I think that's what she has in mind when she talks about air gaps, right? You can't air gap a fucking oil pipeline. That doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense by any stretch of the imagination, not IT, OT, and a billing system. So what we're talking about is segmentation. And really what we're saying is we need to be stepping up this cost of entry and entry threshold for these different types of ops. And what you're saying, Dave, which is the terrifying part, is if we succeed in doing that, if the tide rises and everyone gets a bit better, then that's when we're going to see these people deciding that they probably should invest some of their proceeds into 0 days and other like more resilient shit. And they have the money.
I think someone on the stream chat was saying that like the Chinese groups already buy the O days or have the O days. I think that's why I think this ESET paper is so great, is that like it directly speaks to counter segmentation operations and how they are formed and how they work. And if companies get better at segmentation, then ransomware companies or I don't know what you call them, ransomware groups are also going to be doing cartels will also be working on counter segmentation operations. And that's why this paper is it's like right now, yes, okay, here's a bunch of people that are tied to governments and these are operations tied to governments, PlugX, Retro, whatever it is, right? Like, I don't know all these names, but that doesn't mean that if they wrote this paper next year, that anti-segmentation operations wouldn't be part of, what, I don't know the ransomware companies' names either. So, right. So like all those teams too.
Think of it as I mean, you understand this better than most of us, right? Necessity breeds that kind of innovation, right? Nobody's sitting around writing air gap jumping stuff for the fun of it, except universities in Israel. And I think that's a fine point. If you look at the paper, you said it's like all of them were based on USB. None of them are using like the heat that comes off your processor or whatever, right? Like that's all fun, but it really is kind of very unrealistic, unnecessary scenarios. But the whole point is, nation states developed air gap jumping capabilities because they saw opportunity and necessity, not for fun. Right now, ransomware groups, yes, they could buy O-days. They really don't need to. Yes, they could figure out insane lateral movement techniques and asynchronous protocols, but they don't really need to, right? So what the discussion we need to have as far as like defense for enterprise is, we need to make it so that they need to step up their game. And at that point, we can make targeted ransomware costlier. And if they come in with a 0-day, you go, okay, well, now it's a fight, right? But it really shouldn't be that, oh, they got to VPN that hadn't been patched, and then they got in and they got one set of credentials, and now they own 3,000 endpoints and they PSXF everywhere and they're done, right? Like it's so easy. Like you're talking about a paradigm that's still ahead of what the ransomware cartels are doing right now.
I wonder, I don't have an answer to this, which is, what does the top end of ransomware really look like?
Well, that really is going to vary kind of heavily, because right now I would argue that we're seeing sort of the top end of ransomware. Like, so a couple of the terms. So like, most of the way the ransomware ecosystem is structured right now involves RASs, so a group that's offering ransomware as a service, and their job is like, they own the tools, they'll handle victim communication, they'll handle payment, and you can bring them a like, hey, I've got access to so and so, and they'll be like, all right, they'll broker a deal with you, you'll get a certain cut of the ransom, and they'll do a lot of the work for you, or they'll do it in conjunction with you. And it makes it so that it's a really turnkey almost system now for these groups, and doesn't require a lot of it. It's not how people kept thinking of it, like keep thinking of it in some of the like public discussions, where it's the like, well, like Ragnar Locker took these pictures, and like it's not Ragnar Locker necessarily sending the phishing messages. It's not them popping the RDP sessions. Like a lot of times it's skids from that are just one step up from Hack Forum in some cases, supporting these things.
Most of the time we're talking about fucking affiliates. And I think that's part of what muddies this conversation, is people go, well, the Cyber Command is taking the fight back at Black Matter. And he's like, what do you mean, right? Like Black Matter being like the criminal organization, Black Matter being the developers, or are we talking about like a set of affiliates, or every affiliate? Like these affiliates tend to be affiliates for like 2 or 3 different groups at a time. So if Black Matter goes down, they're going to leverage, whatever Conti nonsense. To your point, Dave, about like the evolution of ransomware, if we're talking about it from a purely technical perspective, what I would expect to see is a streamlining of development for multi-platform stuff. Because when you look at something like Hive, they write their ransomware in Go, but they're not good at Go. So even though Go is cross-compilable, the way they make it breaks cross-compilation. They're using CGO and a bunch of like Windows-specific things. So even though Go is cross-compilable by nature, they're really only using it for easy concurrency so that they can speed up the encryption, but they couldn't cross-compile that same source code for Linux. So I think some streamlining and in general improvement of what the developers in the mid-tier are doing is where I would see the sort of the technical stuff going. But if what we're talking about is the evolution of ransomware as a practice, we saw them go from like individual victims to targeted stuff, to then double extortion, right? You steal the data and you do the leak site and also ransom stuff so that you force the hands of these folks. I think the next part and sort of the unspoken, unpleasant next chapter of all of this is, what about leveraging the data you've stolen, right? Like there's an element where they're leaving money on the table by having 30 terabytes worth of manufacturing blueprints and PII and emails and negotiations and contracts that they tell their victims that they're deleting, but I am almost certain that they're not, unless the hard drives go down or they run out of space or whatever. And any company will tell you that there's immense value to that data. I just think that they don't quite know how to leverage it. Like maybe you take it to your home government. Okay, that's one area. But what about like the data fusion aspect of Chinese ops, where you would take it to another manufacturer and be like, look, man, for 3% of the value of this data, you can have like the Coca-Cola recipe. Right.
It's tricky though, because like it works in China because of the fusion center model that they built, where they pass the data back, it gets chopped up, rewritten, and then passed out as
right. I mean, you're missing that aspect, that data fusion aspect to like making ransomware even worse, right? And I'm glad we're here to give them ideas, right?
Well, I also think the reason I think from a policy perspective this is so important is that you also hear from everyone in the United States government that essentially putting pressure on cryptocurrency and regulating cryptocurrency will also solve ransomware. And this is where I think like the model hasn't been thought through, because I think there's probably like for the small and medium business owners, it might, right? Like they don't have, you're a construction company operating in Hialeah, right? Like you don't have a lot of data that really helps out anyone else, right? So, but I think at the top end, that's not at all true.
Yeah, I don't know how that's supposed to work. I'm a ransomware pessimist in a lot of ways, right? Like I think it's a technological problem, and by the time we fail the technological end, then everything is a matter of like negotiations and pragmatism and real politics stuff. So I don't know how sanctions is supposed to work with entities that can change overnight. And I don't know how offensive ops are supposed to, there's defend forward, and then there's just like, can we pop every box in Russia and China and hope that we like disable everybody, which is nonsense. So I'm very much a pessimist about what's going to happen with ransomware. At the same time, the idea with cryptocurrency, I think this is the beginnings of the deep discomfort that comes with cryptocurrency, with the idea of decentralized currency. And it was easy to consider it niche or criminally derived 10 years ago, when I wish we had all held on to Bitcoins. Now it's a multi-trillion-dollar sector with institutional investing, and it's still only margins of institutional investing. So it's only going to get massively bigger.
I think, the other side of that story is the policy people who are saying we're going to completely regulate all cryptocurrency are smoking crack. This stuff is being sold to you by Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs at this point,
and
like
IBM.
And IBM. It's
like
not gonna.
We're approaching cryptocurrency ETFs now.
Is it okay to at least have the policy brain to know when the horse has left the barn? Like that
I'm
sounds
sorry,
like
but that's on you guys. Like, and this is where I count you in the policy circles. Like, I don't know what the entry threshold is for policy circles, but it seems to be tragically low, like horrendously low. I'm sorry. I went to a think tank once, which will remain unnamed, for a meeting in DC. It's a big one. And they gave me a proposal that they had been working on for like 2 years. And it was to allow people, okay, think of it this way, right? You're a victim and someone introduced a backdoor into your system. So you should have the ability to use that backdoor to get back into the system of the person that attacked you and get your data back. They've been working on this for 2 years. It's just a metaphor that's been overextended. It isn't a technical possibility by any stretch of the imagination. Like, fine, you got 12 lawyers in a room. You couldn't talk to one technical person? One. Sorry. All right. I'm triggered. I'm sorry.
I mean, usually the Cyber Peace Institute can't even spell the words right on their website. You know what I mean?
It wasn't them. I swear it wasn't them. It was a conventional, large, like really well-known think tank in DC. Like really well-known.
I'm with you. I think there's a lot, but one of the cool things about getting more involved with the policy community is figuring out why it's so broken. Is figuring out like what are the things that are really holding the community back. One of them is a lack of peer review. Just like there aren't people out there doing real review of the papers that come out. They release another paper 2 years later that maybe says the opposite thing with the same data, right? So, but no one's out there saying, hey, I don't think this is that, like, come on, right? Like that's a weird part of it. And the other part is some of it's not their fault. They're blind to the real data.
Well, so I would add two comments there. First of all, I think we suffer the same problem as far as peer review goes, right? Like I am brazen and outspoken on Twitter, and I, shit on people when they're unresponsible, or when I think they're being irresponsible, right? Like that ProDaft report, that garbage about Silverfish, we're still dealing with the fallout. There's still people who think that that's a legitimate thing, and it's just somebody fucked up on a pivoting on a piece of network infrastructure, and now we're dealing with it forever. So yeah, we're lacking a kind of record that says, yeah, ESET was amazing on this and they were wrong on this thing, and then SentinelOne was amazing on that and they were wrong on this thing. Like, we all make mistakes. There has to be some record of how things stack up, and there isn't any sort of independent review. The other side of this, and I think it's more a criticism of our failure as technical people who appreciate nuance too much, is that we're not giving the policy folk or the decision makers any palpable answers. So when the policy people show up and say, oh, I've got you, all you need to do is pass this regulation, or all you need to do is, mitigate, the sale of 0 days, or all you need to do is just make sure every organization in the US government has EDR, then that's a solution that a septuagenarian congressperson can sit down and be like, I'm going to write a bill, and like, we just solved this thing. But if you sit down and you go, oh, congresswoman, congressman, this is really complex. There are many shades of nuance, and these are all the ways we could go wrong. They're like, I've got 45 minutes for this meeting. After this, I'm going to go figure out how we regulate like beef coming from a different country. Like, give me a vessel to do something. And we are so, and I'm the biggest, I'm the worst offender on this. We're so caught up in nuance that we never provide practical steps forward. So I think that's where the policy circle wins.
Hey man, speak for yourself. I always provide practical steps forward.
Fair. And like I said, you're my policy gatekeeper. I seldom read these papers because I'm going to have an aneurysm if I do. So I just watch your videos, and then I go, oh, I don't need to read this paper. It was stupid and this, that, and the other way, right? Because Dave said so. So I'm really relying on you here.
I think a lot of those videos and this video, like, we're trying to cover ground that isn't otherwise covered, right? So like, there's a reason we wanted to call out attention to the ESET paper, because I think it could have otherwise, a lot of people wouldn't even have thought twice about it. And the other thing is, I think the complete lack of attention on the Iran stuff. Like, how many people read your paper? How many people read JD Works paper and the Checkpoint paper? Like, and there should be more papers coming out, right? Like, but where are those papers? And I think that's something what we wanted to call attention to, because we feel there is a gap. That's what the Glasshouse is about.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate you bringing up the Iran thing, because it's something I've been seething about, like, quietly or not so quietly, right? I talked about it at Cyber WarCon, but it's really like heavy in my mind. And yeah, I don't know how many people are going to read Meteor Express or the Checkpoint paper, or JD Works is actually surprisingly hard to find, but it's really good. So I'll tweet it out after this. But yeah, the larger issue is, and this is where we marry these two topics. The biggest issue is no one's going to read my stuff or JD's stuff or even ESET's paper or whatever. They're going to read the New York Times coverage. And even though the New York Times has shed amazing weight this week, you'll still get things like Ronan Bergman, who's a fantastic writer, and I adore him, and he's a great, brilliant man, reporting that two random Americans in whatever random position in the government with whatever random visibility of whatever have said that in their intel assessments, this is Israel. And I am not in a
Yes.
position to disagree, but who are they and what do they know and what's their
Yes.
intel assessment? Like,
The reporting is bad. The
It
reporting
is.
is straight up bad.
It
There's
is.
no, I don't know this guy. Do a better job, whoever you are. There were
No,
two
Ronan's
people on.
Ronan's brilliant. You should go read
Right.
Rise and Kill First. It's a fantastic book. He is great, but he's a national security reporter. He's an intelligence reporter. He's not.
Oh, I know
he's
this
tech,
guy, actually,
right?
and frankly, this guy cracks me up. But the reporting is bad. Straight up, it's bad. It's been bad. It's been bad for decades.
Technical editors in the New York Times, like, we can't complain about this enough. And you know, I jumped down on Perlroth, but it's also Sanger. To be fair, it is a general New York Times problem. It's the problem of selling narratives and not clearing up reporting, right? Like, our apologies to JetBrains someday, right?
That's a story we should come back to.
Hold
Like,
on. All right, we have 5 minutes and we're making enemies right now. So very, very vociferous Twitter enemies. So are there things that we'd like to kind of close on? And I don't know, I haven't kept up with the chat at all. So I don't know if folks have been.
I've been trying to moderate the chat also at the same time and drop references to the things we've talked about. I don't have a reference to the JD work paper.
I have to, it's really hard to find. Like, I have to Google like 6 times for it, and then I like narrow in on it, but I have it.
some of the best work is like that in this space.
Well, that's
But
the
I think the
worst part.
last question I had for you and for Silas was your prediction for next year, right? Like, it's that time. Give us your hot take, your one hot take for next year. It's cyber prediction season. Come on.
On what? Is it attackers? Is it defenders? Is it technology? Is it ransomware?
It doesn't
Like,
matter.
you got to scope this down a little bit.
All right. Give me your defenders. Let's do defenders. What's your cyber hot take? I mean, we had big moves this year. We had Mandiant or was it Mandiant who split up, or FireEye?
Mandiant. Well, FireEye is now shed off, and we have the better part of everything that was in FireEye, except
Big
Alex
moves.
Lampstein is now in Mandiant, right? Which is great. So, okay, several things, and some of this is inside baseball, but we're in a strange consolidation phase in the security space. Anybody who's looking for jobs would notice that, right? Like, there's few legitimate shops that are actually interesting, that actually have data, that have the willingness to hire folks, which is, it's interesting. Like, you see this industry kind of go in expansion and contraction, right? You get a bunch of folks getting acquired and a bunch of folks kind of spitting out after. So right now we're in a weird place. I am weirded out by Microsoft's approach to threat intel. They have clearly decided it's a business, and not even a business that requires experts. So you've got 115 salespeople for every one analyst involved in any of these things. At the same time, odd situation, right? Like, they're in this antitrusty position competing with other folks that are dependent on their platforms. I don't know what's going to happen there. I do think that customers are getting more savvy about some of the products they rely on, because they have to, because the technical debt collectors, the ransomware cartels, are getting worse and worse. And if there's any prediction on my part, I think cyber insurance is going to, I'm not going to say collapse, but I think cyber insurance was an ill-advised racket that is now costing the banks way too much, and it has infinite potential for loss. So it's only a matter of time before they start kind of closing the spigot and trying to say, actually, only in these cases, and only to this amount, and only in this degree, and only if you do these things, and maybe not all of those customers, only these. Like, the banks need to start kind of pulling out of cyber insurance as an offering, because it's going to cost them, it's costing them an arm and a leg, and it's giving them a lot of reputational folly as well, right?
All right, what about Silas? We got to switch over. Silas, do you have a hot take for the year?
I do. I think in 2022 we're going to see something game changing. I don't know what it's going to be, but I think 2022 is going to be a big year. I think the past couple of years we've seen a lot of shit that everybody freaks out about, but I think there hasn't been anything truly big. And I actually would even say I don't think Colonial Pipeline was a surprise or big. I think Colonial Pipeline was a expected outcome, and Kaseya also was a expected thing. You get like some ransomware operator that wants to build his street cred, played too much Cyber 77, and like just fucking goes off on shit. I think we're going to see a little more of that happening. Yeah, and actually
All right.
from the chat as well, I think that Ukraine and Taiwan are gonna
Don't
Be part of that.
don't.
Okay. So geopolitical pressure, you see like a lot of potential energy in the system. You see geopolitical pressure, you see like economic pressure, you see technical pressure. There's no real word for that. Like we talk about tech debt, but we don't talk about tech pressure, which is quite funny. All right, let me tell you, I agree with you. I think 2022 is going to be a banger of a year. And I will say the thing that I would like to predict is that the North Koreans have succeeded. And they have penetrated a large portion of the information security community. We saw a report come out that they'd hit China. We know they've been hitting the Americans and everybody else. I think they've done it. I think they are in a bunch of boxes, and that gives them leverage to pop into a bunch of security companies. And from a bunch of security companies, that hits everybody. I think they are holding us at risk right now, and we are ignoring it. And CISA has dropped the ball. NSA's dropped the ball. FBI's dropped the ball. GCHQ's dropped the ball. I don't know who else dropped the ball. Everyone's just sort of staring at that ball, and it's like someone else's problem, like in a high school volleyball game, right? So because it's individuals, it's not companies. They're not important. We don't even like those people, right? Like I think the North Koreans have succeeded. I think we're going to find out 2022.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm with you on security companies being leveraged, but that's a very specific prediction. So
So
all right.
I'll actually note something also. I had a thread I posted to a response to a question from Slowick last night, and I'll bring up something I'd said in that, which is at the end of 2022, we will be following up on this conversation to review our predictions and to thus make fun of ourselves where we were wrong, or the like, motherfucker, I was so fucking like short-sighted.
I don't. Yeah. Do you want to be right or wrong? What do you actually want in this case, right? Yeah. We'll pull up the clip. Hopefully, we're still alive and well and doing this.
And
whatever
Google hasn't
variant,
deprecated YouTube.
yeah, whatever data variant we're living under by the end of 2022. On that charming and very optimistic note, thanks to everybody that showed up. Thanks for everybody that makes this possible. I hope the grug feels better soon. And thank you to Dave, Silas, everybody that, keeps tuning in for these things. I guess we'll see you in January. So Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year. Apparently 2022 is going to be a banger. So, get some rest in. Take care, everybody. Thank you.